Hello and welcome to the Cardiac Cats YouTube channel. I'm your host, Jacob Shorba, and today we'll be breaking down some of the early moves by the Jacksonville Jaguars in preparation for 2023 free agency. This is being recorded pre-combine on a Tuesday, and so there will definitely be some more that's done before free agency, but there's a lot that's already taken place and we want to recap it and really evaluate where this team is, what it tells us about this offseason, just break it down for you, really. So we're going to start by just going over all the moves that have taken place, the details on them, and then we'll go through some rumors as well, what we've heard, and we'll make some observations and project some of the remaining moves. So the first thing we heard, and this has already had a video on it, Foye Oluokun was the first player to be restructured on the team. He had 2 years remaining on his deal, and they decided to add on 3 void years, sign him to roughly about a $10 million signing bonus, and then split that up over all those years. So they saved a pretty good chunk of money. It actually might have been $12 million they signed him to. It was a pretty big bonus. And so we saw that, and what we really learned from it was that the Jaguars, the approach they were going to take was to move this money across a multitude of years so that they could really do whatever they wanted this offseason and really just be ready. And they can kind of deal with that cap hit over the years as this becomes a team that's built a lot more through the draft. And that's ideally what we're going to see and what we expect to see. So Foye Oluokun was the first player to have that happen. And there were also 3 other players this morning that had similar deals done. And so those players were Christian Kirk, Zay Jones, and Brandon Scherff. So overall, these moves together save the team about, I believe, $36 million against the cap this season. And so the reason why is because the total amount of money that's been converted to signing bonus is roughly $45.5 million. It's around there. And so when you convert it to signing bonus, it's split up over all these years. So you've got these 5, and so that's roughly $9 million a year. So $9 million of the 45.5 still hits this season, but you're pushing it down the road. So you see, like, for example, 2027, all these numbers together equal just north of $9 million. And these are just those void years. So that's what the Jaguars have done with their restructures. They also extended, I believe, 2 players. One would just be a new contract, technically, but Robertson-Harris received an extension. A somewhat surprising move. I figured that he would end up going somewhere else, and what the Jaguars decided was to retain him. I think part of that might be concern about whether they could fill that void in free agency or the draft, because I'll just say, like, having evaluated a lot of these interior prospects in the draft, it is not a good class after Jalen Carter. It is a very questionable class. And so there's the issue of that, and then obviously this isn't a team that wants to spend money in free agency, and you're going to get a better deal with Roy Robertson-Harris right now on the team than you would with really any free agent that hits the market. So it makes sense. And so they signed him to an extension worth $30 million over 3 years. So what he has left, there's about $2.3 million that's against the books from signing bonus. He's already been paid. And then there's roughly $38 million. I think it's 37.8 specifically, that he is owed over these next 4 years. So the number in here is not updated. I'm not sure exactly why we haven't got details on it yet, and that's why I held off on doing the video, but hey, here we are. We've got a lot more news. We can't really hold off anymore. And so what I expect is probably for that move to save us around 5 million this year. And so like what we could see this number be around 5 million, and then those following 3 years is roughly 12 million or so. That would kind of add up to around what we're looking at for what he is against the books over all those years, which is about $40 million. So that's my expectation for how that looks. And if you factor that in, then we're looking at the Jaguars, if we go to our calculator here, being around 19 million in cap space, because we're just south of 14 million right now. So you save another 5 or so with Robertson-Harris this season. That's where you're sitting. And so there's still more that's going to be done. But before we get to all that and break that down, I want to talk about some rumors that have been put out there. Some of them being actual statements from the team too. There's some important things to know. And so the first one of these, Evan Ingram is going to be back with the Jaguars. That was confirmed today. I can't remember whether it was Balky or Peterson, but the plan is to re-sign him to a long-term contract. And if that does not work out, they're going to franchise tag him. So he will be their guy for the franchise tag. And I think that's ultimately going to come down to however much Evan Ingram is demanding. Because say that he wants 12.5 or 13 million a year. Well, if we look here, the franchise tag is just south of 11.5 million. So the team would save money if they wanted to franchise tag him instead. So that's an option for the Jaguars. Now, if you do that, he may just demand more money the next season. But hey, who knows? And maybe you want to draft another tight end. It's a really good class, and you kind of have a backup plan. Worst case scenario, right? I mean, obviously, you just want to bring back Ingram on, somewhat team-friendly deal. You want it to be around maybe 12 million a year, hopefully less than that. But I could see it being more, and I think that's kind of where they sit with Ingram. But he's going to be back on this team next year. Only way that doesn't happen is if he refuses to play on the tag and things break down, and I don't think that's realistic. So that's one important thing we learned. Another thing was there was a report that Jawaan Taylor's return to the team, obviously still in question, but that if the Jaguars were not able to retain him this next year, then they would be comfortable just picking up a swing tackle. So essentially the report is that it's not really do or die for the Jaguars. Like they're not too worried about making sure Jawaan Taylor's back. And to me, I'm not taking this report extremely seriously. I take it with a grain of salt because I think Jacksonville is very invested in keeping all these free agents. And I think keeping Jawaan Taylor around here would be a very good move for the organization. Because the way I feel about him as a player, we talked about it before, the question was really, is he going to figure out his run blocking? Because that's the big problem. Like, he's a great pass blocker, he's a great pass protector, but his run game was awful this last year. And I think he has the capability to be better, and I think he will be better this year. I mean, quite frankly, there's no way to go but up for him. So, he's a guy I want to keep around. And I don't really think that report is going to be completely accurate and reflect how the team feels. I think that's going to be a focus for them. I think the only way that Taylor doesn't come back to the Jaguars is if Taylor is demanding like a ludicrous amount of money. And the report was about $15 million a year. And I would pay him $15 million a year. I think the Jaguars would pay him $15 million a year. So that's kind of where they sit with that. And as you can see, franchise tag is not really an option with him. It's just way too much money for this season. And so that was one report I just wanted to hit on. I think Taylor's going to be back. I think this really tells us that the Jaguars want to bring back this whole team, and I think they're going to have the money to do it. So the last thing, sources say that the Jaguars aim to run back the same team in the next season, basically with the addition of Calvin Ridley and all the draft selections, and that they will probably not do anything at all in free agency. I think that's pretty spot on with it. It's clear that the Jaguars want to bring everyone back. Now, will they bring every single player back? No. And Doug Pearson confirmed that today. It's probably not going to happen, and perhaps he means like, oh, we won't have, say, Chris Manhertz back, or we won't get Dan Arnold back, like that sort of thing, but we get the big guys back. And I hope that's what he means, because I'd like to have all these players. But I expect the Jaguars to focus on just retaining everyone on the roster. They've shown that so far. I don't think that's going to change. And I think maybe barring like one player out of all the important guys that you really want to have back that play a big role on the team going into next year, I think they're going to get almost all of them back. Now, as far as free agency, I think you could still see this team spend some money. I think there's going to be a little bit available. And the reason why I believe that too is because look at the cap space for that next year. It's still almost $68 million. The way they're structuring this, like if you compare this to what we did in our mock-off season where we were pushing money down the road, our restructures were not split over a 4-year period after the season too. It was mainly just, okay, we're restructuring it, pushing all this money to 2024. That was our plan. And so the Jaguars have gone to another extreme of that. They have a lot less money counted against the cap in 2024. You know, all this news we've got is great news for the very close future of this team. They're going to have money most likely next offseason. So it's a good situation they're in because of what they've done. They've just got to hit the draft picks, quite frankly, because if you hit the draft picks, then you're not going to worry about $9 million in cap hits in 2026, 2027, all those years, because you're going to have young players who are barely being paid anything. So I think still the Jaguars are going to have a little bit of money. I think they're going to hit probably one or two free agents. I don't think you're going to see any big name, but heading into free agency, what they might look to address, I think the only, I would probably say there's like two positions we could see that they would get a decent player in. It would probably be corner, getting a versatile player, and then perhaps add a wide receiver if they can't bring back Marvin Jones, because they do need another receiver. And I think the best route is either getting Marvin Jones on a really cheap deal or drafting a player. There's going to be some good names hopefully available in the third round, which is a good place for the Jaguars to select a guy. But I don't think they're going to be super active in free agency, so I think that's pretty fair to say. And obviously, we expect Calvin Ridley to be back, and their draft selections, they're going to have him. You know, there's no conversation on that. We know that for a fact. And so I would say that's mostly accurate. And that's kind of our expectation right now. Now, I want to make some observations here, and then we're going to talk about some of the remaining moves, kind of what to expect over the next couple weeks. So, some observations. I think as far as the Jaguars' offense, right now, the way it looks, it is pretty much set in stone what we're going to see this next year. The only question, obviously outside of just Ridley getting reinstated, that's a big thing, but we all know he should be reinstated. I think the biggest question outside of that is whether it's Walker Little or Jawan Taylor starting at right tackle. And then if the Jaguars find an upgrade at left guard in the draft. I think that's another thing that could happen. And I think it's another thing that should happen. I think that's a really important move for this team to make. I think they need to not be complacent on the offensive line and look at, Ben Barch as more of a really nice backup to have. I think that's a better move. Plus, you have the injury concerns. He went down really early in the year, so you can't necessarily sit there and say, hey, we can just be completely reliant on him because you don't know he'll be around all season. So I think as far as the offense, though, everything's pretty much set in stone outside of a couple things on the offensive line. You've got your tight end, is going to be back some way, somehow. That's been confirmed. You could have a second guy thrown in there, but we're talking about starters mainly. Your receivers are set in stone. You've got those guys. You've known them since, pretty much the trade deadline of last year. And then running back, you brought back Hasty even. Your backup's set. Could draft someone, but they just did last year. And then quarterback, well, duh. We know what's going on there, and you have the backup back. So we know what the offense is going to look like for this team, and we know a lot about the defense even too. The front seven, at this point, I don't see any notable changes really happening unless there's a great value available in the draft, or you're looking at Keir Smoot getting signed by another team. And I could see maybe Dwan Smoot getting snagged, and we'll talk about that later, but I think Arden Key will be brought back. I think they'll make a move on that. He'll be a good priority for them. And the last thing is that if there's not any notable free agent signings, assuming the Jaguars don't get someone who's like a clear starter on this team, I think when you look at their draft needs and what the focuses are going to be for the team, it really comes down to two positions at the very top of that, and then a couple that could sneak in. I think the biggest one by far is going to be cornerback, because most likely Shaquille Griffin's not going to be here, and even if he is, you're not confident in him as a starter after what happened last year. So you're going to need a cornerback. That's probably going to be your way of addressing it. So that's almost a lock at this point, that this team hits a cornerback early in the draft. And then you're also looking at probably getting an offensive lineman. If Jawan Taylor's not back, then absolutely, that move's going to happen. But I would see them picking up an offensive lineman that's specifically versatile, high ceiling. Those are the things they're going to like. And so those are probably the two biggest focuses we're going to see in the draft. I could also imagine the team making a surprise selection of a tight end early in the draft still, even with Ingram coming back. This class has a lot of players that are just really good and make sense for Jacksonville. The main one being Dalton Kincaid. The way he plays, he just feels like another Zach Ertz, and obviously Doug Peterson knows a lot about Zach Ertz. And Luke Musgrave is also another super athletic guy with a ton of potential. Could be a selection the Jaguars like. So I could see tight end sneaking in, and I think that wide receiver could be on the table on day 2, because right now they really don't have that possession contested catch guy. Without Marvin Jones back on the team is lacking that. And so you'd want to get someone for the red zone, someone who'd fit in really well as that fourth receiver, could start for the team if needed. The obvious guy for that wouldn't require a first-round selection is Xavier Hutchinson. Makes sense in about every regard. So he's a name that we're going to watch really closely in the draft. Outside of that, there's some other guys you could see. Maybe a Cedric Tillman would make sense for what they'd like. But that's kind of what I'm expecting. Based off of these moves, based off the things we're hearing, that's kind of how we're looking at the draft now. Now, to wrap this up, we're going to talk about some remaining moves we could see before free agency. So just to update this cap space, this will not be completely accurate, but just generally to reflect what this is going to be, we're going to set this number around $5 million. Let's see. Right about there. That's around what cap hit's going to be. So this isn't a correct deal. We don't have the extra years thrown on, but it still tells you how they're looking at this season. So this is probably around what their cap space is, maybe a little more. Now, the moves we can expect. Shaquille Griffin, he's either going to be traded it's possible that he's traded. It is possible. He could be released by the team, probably the most likely, or something I could imagine. I still don't think it's going to happen, and I actually just want to say I think it's a bit of an overreaction right now to think he's sticking around just because no one's been cut yet. This happens a lot where we overreact because we want to see something and it doesn't happen. For example, Taven Bryan, like we all wanted him gone like instantly, and it happened later. It took time. And so this is kind of the same thing to me, but I think it's possible still that the Jaguars could negotiate a gigantic pay cut with him. And so looking at his number, your prorated bonus, this is what's guaranteed. This has already been paid out to him. So you can't change anything about that. What would change is all the money past $4 million. I could see the Jaguars saying like, hey, you could stick around here and we'll pay you $2 million this year, like something minimal. But I don't think Shaquille Griffin's going to accept that. I think for him, he could get an okay deal somewhere and really just chalk things up to an injury from last season. That would be the smart way to go. But hey, maybe he just wants to stay around, take absolutely no money, and be in Jacksonville. I mean, you just don't know, right? And so I don't expect that, but it is possible. So we're probably looking at him getting cut. We're going to have Calvin Ridley potentially getting reinstated before. I think more realistically, you'll see that towards the end of March. So probably a week or two into free agency. Evan Ingram will either be re-signed or tagged onto the team. Now, if he is tagged, your issue is that this cap space, that's all coming out this year. You can't backload a deal if you're tagging him. And so we could see another player get restructured. You could see, just trying to think of an example of one. Either you could look at, like, oh man, who did I have in mind? Darius Williams. That would be one player they could do it with. He's probably the last candidate I would consider. And then the other things they could do is negotiate new contracts. And so it's possible we see this with Ingram. I still think that a long-term deal is going to be done ultimately, whether he's tagged or not. The tag is more so a placeholder. It's more so to keep him around. And so if they tag him, you could see a long-term deal done. So that's another thing that I could see. I think as far as like free agents we're going to have an official answer on right now, I think before free agency we'll know with Jawan Taylor, Marvin Jones, Arden Key, Andrew Wingard, and Riley Patterson. Those are the names that I expect to be like just their outcome is known with the team. Because if any of those players are hitting free agency, I don't think they come back. Andrew Wingard, maybe. But I think like Riley Patterson is just going to be one you're going to see someday this week. Like, oh, he's back on the minimum. Because with him, all they got to do is do this ERFA tender. They don't even pay him $1 million. And he's back on the team. So it's a brain dead move. Like, you're going to make that unless you feel like, hey, we need to upgrade that position. Yeah, if they do, okay. Just make sure he's not missing a ton of kicks in the regular season. I'd prefer Riley Patterson, but it's not a huge deal. But if Jawan Taylor hits the market, like he's probably gone. Marvin Jones would be gone. I think that would show the team just didn't get a deal done. Arden Key, I think there'd be a lot of teams hitting up for his services. He's valued pretty high right now from all sources. And then that's really it. These other guys, I could see them coming back just kind of randomly. Like Trey Herndon, I think, will be a player we'll randomly hear news on. He'll be back for like a veteran minimum. And I think they should, by the way. I think it's absolutely a good deal to have him as a depth piece. He can start if you need it. Could also see it. Oh man, I don't know who else on this list. Maybe a Tim Jones. That's possible. But that's kind of what I expect. And we also need to factor in CJ Beathard has been re-signed. His deal, I think, is $4.5 million over 2 years, so that's not factored into this number. And obviously, this number isn't fully correct because we don't know what Evan Ingram's deal will look like yet. I think with Dewan Smoot, why I don't consider him to be a player that gets re-signed these next couple weeks is because of his injury. I don't think the team's going to be comfortable re-signing him, and I don't think any other team will be either. I think he's going to be a player that we're going to figure out what's going on with him a little better in like maybe late March or early April. And then we see the Jaguars bring him back on a relatively cheap deal, or if they feel really confident in his progression, hey, maybe that long-term contract gets done. And I think that would be fine, as long as you feel like he's going to come back and play pretty good, because if he's anything like he was late last season, you're getting a really good rotational guy in, really good lineman in, and you want that on this team. The final things that I could see, and I think these will more likely just come at any time before the draft. I don't necessarily expect them to happen for sure before free agency. I think we're going to see 2 players get re-signed long term. I think the first one that's going to happen for sure is Jamal Agnew, because this is a place where they can save money. Right now, they're around $6 million against the cap. You can get that number down. And so I think he'll come back. He'll probably get paid a little more than what he did on the first deal, probably looking at like $5 million to $6 million a year. And then outside of that, I think Josh Allen could be a surprising re-signing this offseason. I think he could be extended. I think the ceiling for Josh Allen is enormous, and you saw him kind of figure things out late last year. And if this team bought in on Robertson-Harris from how he finished last season, and that was really where so much of that production came from if you look at his stats. So consider that. The Jaguars might be all in on re-signing Josh Allen long-term now. And I think that's the smartest decision they can make, because I don't think he's going to necessarily like fall off a cliff next season. I think he's going to be at least as good as he was. And I don't expect that, big streak where he just is a complete non-factor in games. I don't think that's going to happen again. And even during this streak this year, he still had an impact in some way or another. So I think that deal will also happen. As unlikely as that may seem, I think that's one we're going to end up hearing about in the coming months. So that's kind of our breakdown. We've got a few more moves we're going to see. We'll get official cap numbers a little closer. And after all these players are re-signed here, I think this team's going to have enough cap space if they want to go pursue a few free agents. I don't think they're going to be signing some big name. I don't expect that. But I think there will be a couple guys they go after. And, another thing throw in there just to consider, Trevor's talked about how he's discussed it with players from other teams. Some of them have said, hey, put in a good word for me. I want to come over there. So you might have interest from some players in coming to this team. You might have some good deals that can be negotiated. And so I do think this team will do something. I think they will look to address their needs. And the only need I expect them to absolutely address in free agency would probably be cornerback. Unless they're having Shaquille Griffin back on like a stupid cheap contract. So that's all I've got. We're going to have some more news coming up soon, I'm sure. We'll have more to talk about. And the Combine's really going to tell us a lot. We are pretty far now through our draft prospects. I think I'm around 90 players done. I'm going to do 225. So the rate I'm going right now, I hope to have that out for y'all within hopefully a few weeks. I think it can get done that fast, and that'll be really fun to go through and a cool resource for you guys to use. Look at these prospects, kind of how we project them to Jacksonville if they're signed, and just know a little more about the draft. My favorite time of year, unless your team's winning playoff games. So with that all said, I thank you guys for watching today. I appreciate all your time you spend on here and all the comments and support. I hope you have a great rest of your day. And finally, go Jags.